Turns out the word tactical can be more useful than just trying to sell you cheap nylon gear at the local surplus store. In this episode, we are going to cover TTPs and dig into what they are. The term TTP refers to tactics, techniques, and procedures, and is one of those military jargon words that gets lost in this soup rather quickly. But have no fear, if you are someone who has never stepped foot in the military, even those of us who spent time there have recognized that terminology of this sort can oftentimes suffer from bureaucratic bloat or become very vague. In an earlier episode with Chris Sizlove, he talked about how the term lethality had been so wishy-washy shifted that it could somehow mean just about anything and nothing at the same time. In this episode, we are going to begin with the Army definition for tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then move on to a more useful one for our scenario. Then following that, we'll cover some Army examples of what TTPs look like and why that's relevant in the small unit tactics arena, and then move on to examples that are not directly military at all. And then from there, we want to have a small conversation on how I think it fits into the Second Amendment, or should, and finally, what you as the citizen can do. And have no fear, I'm not simply going to recommend that you go out and buy the Ranger Handbook, and as if that is some sort of solution, we are going to look at least one small unit tactic or a battle drill in this episode. Before we go much further, this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and they are a manufacturer out of Minnesota that deals mostly with metal parts and precision manufacturing. If you go into your safe, you may very well find something in there that unbeknownst to you was manufactured by them, but more importantly, they sell a set of toolkits and firearms parts that come with a lifetime warranty. And then finally, if you're bringing an idea to life and you're looking for a manufacturer, go ahead and then check them out at Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com and use the code below for 10% off your purchase. Now, let's begin with definitions. The Army definition, or at least one example, if that doesn't send up a red flag, of TTPs breaks down tactics, techniques, and procedures like this. A tactic is the ordered arrangement of forces in relation to each other, the enemy, and the terrain. Note, in this definition, one of the key elements is the ordered arrangement of forces, multiple people involved. Second is techniques, methods of completing a mission, function, or task. And then finally, we have procedures, which are standard detailed steps on how to perform a specific task. And while you might look at these terms as having a little bit of gray area between them, have no fear, that again is expected. But I'm going to use what I will call a more useful definition here. A tactic is the applied movement and organization of multiple people and of different skill sets to the completion of a single objective. A technique is how an individual plays their role in that tactic, and procedures are how the individual completes specific tasks within their role. What that might look like in TTPs, a collective definition of TTPs is what happens when individuals use procedures to perform techniques as part of a group to accomplish an action. That is when we call it a tactic. TTPs then are oftentimes specific to a group or an organization or a unit. They're not quite the same as SOPs. Those are standard operating procedures. You might say one is an umbrella term of the other. All SOPs are TTPs, but not all TTPs are SOPs. That might be one way of saying it. But TTPs can function as a sign of organization as well. And so if you're looking at listed tactics, techniques, and procedures for the accomplishment of a collective goal, you might be dealing with some form of an organization, and therefore that might be a sign that what you're up against is not simply the ragtag militia that has no leadership. Finally, let's get into some Army examples. Three examples that are given of a tactic in the Army. These tactics, when you talk about them outside the military, depending on what era you're in, whether it's in the 2000s or the 1990s or the little GWAT era, the middle GWAT era, not little, oops, you might get levels of like reverence or mysticism, or they might going to be talked about as either a marketing word or like a magic word or something of that sort. But tactics, when they are applied, especially on the small unit level, don't really have that much magical material in what they are. The thing that makes them work is the team's cohesive and collective movement. So a tactic would be something like a movement to contact, where you organize your forces in a certain way so that they are most able to react to contact. And then the movement of that is one tactic. You might say that the small unit tactic within that would be a react to contact, or a break contact, or a react to near or far ambush. Then, so these things, if we're going to talk about, say, a battle drill, and these are just in the combat MOSs, a battle drill is a collective action rapidly executed without a deliberate decision-making process, which is why battle drills are often considered synonymous with small unit tactics. And if we look out through history, as Zach Masick illustrated in a recent episode, the idea of small unit tactics is not a novelty in the span of mankind. It may have taken a bit of a backseat for a while in reference to conventional versus unconventional warfare. Famously, both the Rangers and the Green Berets tend to point to Robert Rogers as their history. And one thing that Robert Rogers was known for is that he organized his men in such a way that they would have something kind of like battle drills. It was like an early version of that compared to what we're dealing with today. But a technique within a battle drill might be something like bounding overwatch, where when one person or one element is maintaining fire, the other one is moving up. And these could even be broken down into things like successive versus alternating bounding. I know the terms will go on and on and on, but a technique is something that an individual will do as part of the tactic. And sometimes multiple individuals are doing the same thing, bounding overwatch being an example. Finally, the procedures that a person might engage in would be things like a call for fire, a signal for shift fire. These are going to be individual techniques that tend to take place above the level of skills. Skills being shoot, move, communicate, or just shoot. Being able to use your equipment, being able to use your reloads and so on and so forth. And so we're really talking about procedures as just a little bit above that. You might very quickly get into this kind of hierarchy as we're going forward. But this isn't the only place that we've seen TTPs implemented. And this may come at a point where I might have to reveal my hand a little bit, where there's chatter in the news cycle that Derek Chauvin may be pardoned. And as a result, I know this is just kind of in the chatter sphere. This isn't a hard piece of information or intel, but it's sort of this, let's say, common talking point that's making its way around the circuit. And that is that Derek Chauvin may be pardoned, and that that cities like Minneapolis are preparing for potential protests or riots. And there's kind of a funny term. I mean, we're looking at the month of May right now. And this has been referred to as, at least in Minnesota, as riot season. And I think that one of the hilarious things about that is it kind of stuck a lot quicker than, say, was expected, but then also is just now a commonly accepted term, and at least in many places. And so the term riot season, I first began hearing it in 2021, basically a year after the death of George Floyd. So during the so-called Summer of Love, we witnessed an obfuscation of what you might say, consider, or not consider a group. There might be this thing as there's no such thing as Antifa, it's an idea. But what we've observed firsthand, myself, as well as others, is that I don't think that exactly was the case. And rather, as I mentioned earlier, the existence of TTPs can be somewhat of a piece of evidence, can be a piece of evidence that you're dealing with an organization. And I came across a website called CrimeThink, which is spelled CrimeThinc. That's crimethink.com. And it's interesting because there was an anonymous article published there about what you might just call the TTPs of the siege of Minneapolis, or the siege of the 3rd Precinct. And if I have the article up here, The title of it is The Siege of the Third Precinct in Minneapolis, an account and analysis, published on CrimeThink. The author lists a series of things that are very easy to understand as TTPs, but it gets a little bit more specific. It's not as specific on what I'd say procedures, but as we get into techniques and then tactics, it gets very specific. So in the opposite of like overall perspective to granular, what we have here are a series of TTPs for an unnamed anarchist group that participated or was active in the siege of the third precinct by their own account. So one example of a technique is some people would suppress the police by throwing projectiles at them. Another group of people would distract the police, which would allow saboteurs to get access to a target building or access to another area. Throughout the article, the police are always listed as the enemy, and the activities of people involved are broken up into different roles. Like as I brought up earlier, some would suppress the police while others would distract them. What I mean by suppress them is throwing projectiles to keep their heads down. Another one would be to distract the police, to pull them from one location to another so that others could get into it. There might be looting of battlefield supplies, or the film and selective distribution of material to create a certain image. Now, I thought this last one was a strange example because it was done so overtly and intently that it just completely blew past the idea of, well, hey, you are publishing a lie. But once again, when you say things like there is no truth but power, one should approach anything you say as a deception. It's just, well, if I'm going to tell you I'm lying to you in an elaborate way, or that I am morally obligated or it's morally acceptable for me to lie to you for the sake of the acquisition of power, then you should probably expect them to lie with one face and then lie to you with the same mouth that they're trying to convince you to join their party. But let's look at some tactics. One of the most useful or overtly cited forms of tactics would be the use of peaceful protesters on the scene where they wanted to accomplish some objective that might be listed almost as a military objective, like the burning of the third precinct. They wanted listed peaceful protesters on site to present the spectacle of legitimacy, which is their words, not mine, and serve as a crowd to hide in so others could perform their other functions. So essentially, we are dealing with peaceful protesters by their own definition as functioning human shields in both the social sense and the physical sense in the location. And then you would have the use of ballistic squads, their terms, not mine, of people throwing rocks, projectiles, Molotov cocktails, their list, not mine, and fireworks to maintain the attention or the suppression of the police. Third would be looters who would break into buildings and acquire as well as distribute resources, and this is their description of it, to feed, motivate, and, quote, heal the crowd. Another one that came out that was given a comical name would be the use of laser pointers by specific people. They refer to them as light mages, kind of dorky, kind of cool. But they would use laser pointers to temporarily blind either police or attempt to disable things like cameras. And so their quote that they use in the article, "We combine without becoming the same. We move together without understanding one another, and yet it works." This is again from CrimeThink. Illustrates the use of tactics, particularly as what we've heard politically, the diversity of tactics. But there is an example of an organization here. You have different people playing different roles to accomplish a common goal, even if part of that common goal is some people are deceived into it, that they're invited in to be participating as peaceful protesters, or those people posing as peaceful protesters are explicitly and intentionally presenting themselves as such so as to produce the spectacle of legitimacy and to conceal their comrades. I know that might come across as derogatory at the same time. So maybe the people who were peaceful protesters knew that their peacefulness was merely a spectacle. that would be an effective tactic at that time. And if we were to see that recreated, doesn't mean that everyone who claims to be a peaceful protester is a liar. But if we were to see this recreated where you'd have one group present themselves as peaceful protesters, whereas another brought their Molotov cocktails and hid in the crowd, we now have at least one data point to become suspicious of whether or not that organization is spontaneous. It might actually have some level of organization. This leads to a question about the Second Amendment. Does it apply merely to property, or does it apply to TTPs as well? Our generation within the gun culture has shifted away from what might be thought of as the generation that was more concerned about owning than using, although that's a bit derogatory at best. And one of the things about our current generation of the gun culture that I am most encouraged by is that there is an increased desire to understand not just the Second Amendment as some sort of legal defense or legal claim to owning a firearm, but that there's something behind it. There's actually a justification for what that is. And and as we understand that justification, what brought about the Second Amendment as something not merely utilitarian, but perhaps something more about the identity of a human life as bearing human rights. As we get into that field more, as we dig in that direction, we're seeing that natural evolution that the Second Amendment isn't merely about the possession of equipment and tools, but it might also argue that the individual has a right in that sense to practice TTPs in this sense, or for this episode, and what they do. There is a moral imperative implied within the Second Amendment that a private citizen has a right, that private citizens have a right to own the means of their own defense. And there's also a utility within that, which is private citizens who are armed are both more able to defend against tyranny and also less likely to participate in it. But this is not universally true across the entire world. We're also starting to look that there has to be some moral ethic involved as well. Just because people own arms doesn't mean that they're going to be moral. So so how does the citizen who is not in the military, who's not in law enforcement, how do they approach TTPs? There has been some discussion about the development of TTPs, and as we illustrated earlier, it involves multiple people, and it's going to require some genuine work. There's going to have to be some testing, but let's get into it. Let's get into objections that are common against people developing or even learning TTPs, learning tactics, techniques, and procedures. Let's just say small unit tactics alone. Well, one, there might be a limitation of resources, not enough land to practice them, not enough access to, well, I wouldn't say access to print material, but there's not enough, say, materials to complete that, whether it's vehicles or bunkers or whatever. But there's also another realistic problem that we deal with in our age, which is not enough manpower. We listed it earlier that tactics imply multiple people being involved. And if it's just you yourself, you really can't practice, quote, tactics. But that also then leads to a question of public image. And these aren't objections that I think individually hold out. I'm not giving them validity. I'm bringing them up as in these are common objections that I've heard, oftentimes with a sense of exasperation. And one of them most specifically is the public image, is that I want to go practice with my friends how to do something, but I don't want to be thought of as a terrorist or an organization. And if you look back to, again, 2010, it was Mike Glover's initiation. He initiated a sort of an online organization tool that was listed as a terrorist organization. I think it was 2020 or was that 2021? Whatever. Whether it's around anymore is beyond the pale. But the point was that the mere existence of organization was the threat of a terror cell, which again brings up or a sign of a domestic terrorism. The nature of this environment does put a certain amount of risk and pressure involved, and not everyone's willing to make that, which is why you're not going to have as many people involved with it. And finally, if you put all that cake together, it's really hard for citizens to validate the effectiveness of TTPs without without doing things that are actually immoral. So, like, for example, it's you got to be careful about, say, building a pattern of life on people, because it can be hard to distinguish from stalking. But as we move on, there's also a rationality to copying the military, and that would be that the military in its own sense, and I'm using this as kind of a baseline rationale that's been used, the military is at least in theory battle proven. The military at least in theory has experience, and the military at least in theory has ways of validating whether or not their TTPs work. But as far as the ethic, I think a man ought be lethal, but he is responsible for his use of force. So let's get into one battle drill and what is one example of a tactic broken down. And we're going to talk about reacting to an ambush. You have heard that you can go out and buy military manuals. You can go out and buy the Ranger Handbook, which was translated at one point into Arabic, potentially to be given to the Taliban. But I can tell you to go out and pick up a copy of the Ranger Handbook, and I can also give you an explanation of how to react, say, to an ambush. And I have chosen react to ambush for one specific reason, is that there's a variation between a near and a far ambush that is made early on in the tactic. In other words, how you react to what they define as a near ambush is different than how you react to what is referred to as a far ambush. And these use different techniques like establishing a base of fire, flanking, shifting fire, or they just involve bounding and bounding overwatch to react to that ambush. So the difference between a near and a far ambush is determined by hand grenade range. The effective range of a hand grenade is 35 meters. So what is considered a near ambush is any sort of ambush within 35 meters. Outside of 35 meters is referred to as a far ambush, and you react to a near ambush differently than you react to a far ambush. A team, a squad, a unit, an element, whatever the term that we're using for this description, if they were to, say, be ambushed in a near ambush fashion, if they were to encounter a near ambush, the TTP, the react to near ambush small unit tactic or battle drill, which the definition of battle drill is a collective action rapidly executed without a deliberate decision-making process. The battle drill of react to near ambush is to have all the members of the team face the threat, get into some semblance of a line opposing the threat, not in line with it, and then to push through or bound through, establishing a dominance of fire. In other words, there's the term that people refer to as turn and burn, but if you encounter a near ambush, because you're within hand grenade range, the designated tactic, as simple as it is to have everybody face the enemy, affirm that they're on line, and then, or confirm that they're on line, they're in a line in opposition to, say, the enemy, and then they're going to move through and push through that threat. So a near ambush, though, is going to be different than a far ambush. In a far ambush, something where you have some distance between you and the element or the people that are ambushing you, that distance being greater than 35 meters, whichever element took fire first is going to establish something called a base of fire. And that means if our I don't even have a whiteboard for this. If our ambushing element, if our opposing element is up here and our team is moving this direction, if they're moving horizontally and they get attacked from the side, one group is going to get online and they're going to establish as close to fire superiority as they can. They're going to engage with the enemy while the other half of the team is going to break away, make a very large movement, and come in at the side. What they're going to end up doing is they're going to have one team attacking the enemy while the other team is flanking the enemy. And this is a simple example, again, as I illustrated earlier, that tactics they're not oftentimes complicated. What makes people, say, good at it is that they're able to understand the rules and the principles of a tactic and effectively use them like a tool. Tactics should be used like tools where there are expected ways to do it, but then there are things that need to get pushed a little bit or pushed left and right in order to make that fit the circumstances, but it doesn't mean that the whole, let's say, baby is thrown out with the bathwater. And so then if you want to learn more about tactics, TTPs, particularly small unit battle drills, as I said earlier, I'd recommend going to something like the Ranger Handbook and begin reading it for yourself. I'm sure you can download I'm sure you can download them on the internet, but more importantly, probably good to have one in hand. Just to look at how these small, short, effective maneuvers work on the small unit side. I think this is also safe to assume because most citizens are going to be working in the small unit tactics arena anyway. So I don't expect there to be a battalion outside of some form of organization like the military, but because that's a lot of people. But let's get into some things to be careful of or avoid when you're developing your own TTPs. One of them is training scars, and that training scars oftentimes are the result of using training equipment to try to recreate as close to what you can as possible without putting a danger to your team. And the training scar would be something that's practiced repeatedly, that is used, that is detrimental to somebody's lethality or efficaciousness in a, let's call it, real world scenario. But there's a video that came up maybe 2 years ago about two men kind of chicken head popping their popping their head kind of like a chicken through a doorway to get a sneak peek of what's inside. And while it looked funny from the video, the videographer's perspective, it also illustrated a good example of what airsoft can do. It doesn't mean that airsoft is a bad training aid. It's that what it can do is it can give you a false sense of security on what a wall can do when it comes to stopping, say, bullets. A lot of the Western world, a lot of America's homes are built with drywall, and drywall doesn't stop 223 or 9mm. And so one of the training scars that people could develop is when they're learning how to, say, clear a room, they begin to view those walls, those parts of the structure, as capable of stopping bullets when they're anything far from it. And so they might peek into a doorway, be seen by the enemy, and jump back behind the wall trying to get away, not realizing that, well, the bullets are going to pass through that wall. That's just not a common thing. And I'm sorry, that is just a common thing. And so when you're looking at training scars of this example, it's worth going through and developing your own TTPs and then considering them for things that might be, say, giving you a specific advantage or disadvantage based on the training tools you're using. Another one would be artificial limitations that people can deal with, which is, let's say you only have 1 acre to work with. A bounding maneuver, a flanking maneuver is going to take up more than a square acre. It might take quite a decent amount of distance, which is where your cardio is going to matter. So, do a little bit of that. But what we might deal with is in the environments that we have to practice on, we might be constrained a little bit by the environments, the legal environments, such as what we do. But this is to say that you can create your own TTPs. And the suggestion would be to look at what the objective is, look at what you're trying to accomplish, recognize that they're going to be constantly evolving to some extent, and those evolutions really do fit the Darwinistic approach of microevolutions, might grow into larger evolutions. But this is also being done at various levels. Now, Mike Megan, who's been on the show before, has addressed that doctrine is important. So you can go back to doctrine, and trust me, yes, it is dry to read, but beginning at the small unit level and building upwards, it's a body of knowledge that sort of adds to itself. Maybe you can get to the point where you're like, hey, I got 5 people that I do stuff with. You probably don't need to work at the company level. So you can build with what you got and then adapt it to what you need. Now, this has worked in the past, but we have a weakness, which is to get confused with dogma versus principles. And what I mean by dogma in this case is that because the Ranger Handbook says so, then and my understanding of it is perfectly true and appropriate in all common scenarios. Don't get into the comments about that one unless you really have to. What are the dogmatic battle drills? Oops. But finally, I think this should just be, use it in this form. Build, adapt, learn, and adjust. Seek out experts, learn from them, adapt them to what you need, and then accept responsibility for what you're doing. If you build your own TTPs, you're going to have to adapt them to different scenarios. That require courage to test them without testing them live. And then from there, learn from other opportunities, other examples of people who've done those, because as you become more familiar with what makes them, say, effective, like the flow of fire, or battlefield superiority or talking guns, then you might be able to adjust it to the circumstances that you're in. All in all, this being the case, you can create your own TTPs. And I'm going to return to the first definition, that a TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures, might break down like this. According to the Army, the ordered arrangement of forces in relation to each other, the enemy, and the terrain. A tactic involves multiple people. A technique is a method of completing a mission, function, or task, or it's one person's participation within a tactic as a whole. And a procedure is a standard, detailed set of steps on how to perform a specific task. The definition that if you combine these together, when individuals use procedures to perform techniques as part of a group to accomplish a collective action, we might call it a tactic. And tactics, the TTPs themselves, might be a sign that you're working not just with randos, but with some amount of organization. When people who have similar experiences get together, one of the first things they might establish is their TTPs. Like, hey, this is how we're going to do this. Yeah, I got it. And they'll do some dry runs. They'll do some walkthroughs just to make sure they know how they're going to say enter and clear a room, enter and clear a trench, and so on and so forth. And we've seen how TTPs have emerged from not directly, but say paramilitary or even insurgent activities. Insurgents themselves have TTPs, which is a signal that you're dealing not with some just spontaneous social movement, not a bunch of, say, activists, but you might be dealing with something closer to an insurgency. And finally, as we closed off with, there are ways that citizens can develop their own TTPs. They can borrow from the military and adapt them to their own. They have access to many of those, especially on the small unit tactics level, which you can acquire through reading or maybe other episodes like this. And finally, I want to make sure that, yes, you're going to run into some pitfalls, some rationality why you shouldn't do something or you won't do something. But what's important is that if you're going to develop TTPs with your buddies, recognize you're going to have to make some adaptations, maybe learn from this influence over here, learn from that material over there, adapt them to your own environment. And finally, perhaps most importantly, take responsibility for those, whether or not they're effective, and particularly making sure you wield them morally. So this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast closes off on Friday, the 16th of May. Thank you for listening in. Thank you for being a part of the show. We are reopening the store. We are going to be reopening the store today. Friday, the 16th of May, we're going to be offering a limited pre-sale or a pre-order on not only some of the t-shirts that we have, we're bringing one of them back. We're bringing two of them back, the classic and updated version of the list, which may or may not have a series of names affiliated with one noteworthy bad person. And then we're adding a new one to the shop referred to as the Classified. If you want to go pick up any of those in a pre-order fashion, go ahead and head over to redactedllc.com. You'll also find some new stickers now available, including a much larger version of the classic Redacted bar. But finally, we have one treat that we're adding to the shop that is will be referred to as Sir Breathless, the Lord of War, in the form of a prayer candle. So if you want to support the show, if you want to be a part of that, you can head over to redactedllc.com. There you'll also find out where our upcoming events are. In the near future, we are going to San Diego to do a public land cleanup with Narco. So that'll be in July. With that being the case, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening. Now go forth and conquer.
Why do we quit when it gets rough? Why do we lie to those we love? Why do we quit when it gets rough? And I just wanna say